Hello, welcome. Get your names down for the fourth assignment. Hi, glad to have
Good
you.
afternoon, Professor Cowell.
Let's see here. Hello to everyone. Let's see here.
Professor Cowell.
So we're doing part 2 of the Gilded Age, as characterized by Mark Twain. And we are dealing primarily with immigration on this one. Has anyone had the opportunity to read this so far?
No, not yet.
Feel free to unmute yourself if you have.
Professor Cowell.
Hi.
Just letting you know I'm currently at work, but I am listening on my AirPod. So I'm gonna do my best.
Sorry, this takes me a little bit.
All good. I just want to let you know I'm listening and with my AirPod and stuff, but I'm technically at work, so but I'm here.
Come on. Good. Christian race. All right, great. And there. See if we still have more. Oh, this is wonderful. Let's see here. All right. Okay, I'm going to share the page. So what we're doing now is we're covering 2 argumentative sections on the facet of immigration into the U.S. during the Gilded Age. And the first one primarily, actually 3 sections, right? The first section primarily deals with the Jewish immigrants. And there's a definitive thesis that I want you to look for. You can find it in the title. I wanted to give you a little bit of just context. Usually, right, American historians, this is kind of archaic. I'm sure it's become more sophisticated of a study than this. But they began by looking at push and pull factors that may have pushed certain groups, certain demographics from other areas around the world out of their country. And oftentimes those reasons tend to be political and economic, and as well as the pull factor of the United States bringing in immigrants, attracting immigrants simultaneously. And so you find the same common economic and political factors that you find oftentimes in human history in the narratives of the Gilded Age immigration. For one, right, with number 1 is you could look at outright persecution and social and cultural intolerance in the Russian Empire, particularly in present-day Poland, against the Jewish community. So if you've had a chance to read it, I try to give some detail on that discrimination, the fact that they were forced to live in shtetls, their own parts of villages outside, known as the Pale of the Roman Empire, and away from Kiev and Moscow and the major cities of the Russian Empire. You have incidents of, so you see Russian Empire is huge. The May laws, local and the central government established quotas limiting how many Jews could enter certain professions in schools and depriving them of opportunities to buy property or to enjoy the rights of citizenship. And you find that's a common thing. Rome did it, the Scandinavian states. There are different levels of citizenship that oftentimes are ascribed to certain groups within a given polity or government. and the Jews were no exception. They were within their own unique, semi-excluded and segregated status in Europe, but especially, like I said, in present day Moldova, Poland, and the Ukraine and Belarus within the Russian Empire. You have the Easter celebrations, and just, it's just crazy. Some of the social stigma of the Jewish people in Europe, going back to the Black Plague, when a lot of them had better, kosher rules on hygiene. And so the Black Plague kind of almost missed them. And there's great resentment about that. They weren't guilty of the crime. They were exempt from the sin of the Catholic Church in Catholic Europe of usury, lending money at interest. So they were given an exception to be able to do such. And so you get those stereotypes that you see, sadly, all the way at least through the Third Reich of Nazi Germany. Killers of Christ, money-loving, exploitative Jews, and so you see this erupt in Russia in the 1880s and 1890s, and it's not a coincidence that so many Jewish immigrants came to the United States at that time, with that type of push factor back in the Russian Empire. But when they came, right, I wanted to make it clear that it was not a bed of roses for them. Oftentimes they did what a lot of immigrant groups did, is they congregated together and they formed ethnic enclaves. And an enclave, right, like Chinatown, is a nationally, ethnically, almost culturally homogenous part of a city that they moved to. And so you had these, little Italies, little Dublins, little, they wouldn't have called it anything of that sort, but where the Jewish community resided. And it was primarily the Lower East Side of Manhattan. My primary source for this, or it's actually a secondary source, but my main source that I use is City of Dreams by Tyler Ambinder. Interesting book and rather informative. But at any rate, when they came in, oftentimes they were provided work from fellow Jewish immigrants. Oftentimes it was in the garment industry, and they would sew within the tenement apartments. And I thought that I had a picture. Yeah, you see like this picture on the left. They established their own synagogues and Hebrew schools and other types of social and cultural establishments. Because remember, we as human beings are just that. We're human beings. We have an entire set of, anthropological, sociological, psychological, emotional, economic needs. And so the Jewish community, you have evidence of them, and this is not exceptional, of them really kind of fending for themselves. But oftentimes, right, look at some of the numbers here of socioeconomic mobility, as I have here in red. In fact, he contends that within one single generation, Jewish immigrants crammed into unsanitary apartments, sewing clothing, diminished by over 25%. So they were, stuck in this level of the proletariat, doing tedious, miserable, low income producing work. But 1 out of 4 within the very first generation made it out, graduated from that sector of the economy. You look at the young women who worked as the Jewish immigrant women. It reminds me of the Irish before this, like in the 1850s. 60% of them got out of the domestic job, working for other people's as domestic, maids, etc. Got out within the first generation. Those numbers are high relative to other demographics, other groups. And you look at Italian immigrants, Hungarian immigrants, Polish immigrants. The numbers don't seem, Russian immigrants, they don't seem to be that high. as far as getting out of the proletariat within the very first generation. So what did they do? Is you have here, a lot of them became entrepreneurs, right? Literally a risk taker who established their own businesses. So many of them in retail. They became professionals like teachers, nurses, dentists, lawyers, rabbis, artisans or skilled workers like cigar makers, butchers, bakers, painters, etc. And so notice the main avenue to the American dream was not yet through academia. It just didn't happen. But it was entrepreneurial by starting businesses. Some of them moved into nicer neighborhoods out of the Lower East Side of Manhattan Island in New York. And but those who did, they experienced some hateful xenophobia. You see signs like no Jews and no dogs allowed. When you look at sources on what they call the New England Brahmin, right? Like the Brahmin, the highest caste of India with a caste system. Those of New England from good, I say good tongue in cheek, okay? Good WASP stock, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant stock, namely, right, that they could put their pedigree back to people who came across on the Mayflower and some of the leading wealthy merchants and well-to-do gentlemen of the New England colonies. You're going to see the rise of anti-Semitism in that sector. So for one, I think of like Henry Cabot Lodge. I think of Henry Adams and others who became senators at this time and said some very blatantly anti-Semitic stuff for their fear of the Jewish people taking over. So hence, it was no paradise, but very simplistic thesis relative to what they had experienced before. There was no outward, overt, de jure, by law, discrimination against them. There were no actual legal impediments to their rise. And technically they could, albeit with social consequences, they could limitedly integrate. They could intermarry with other groups, move into their neighborhoods, etc., especially for those who converted to Christianity. And so basically just with number one, right, that it was America constituted a lesser evil than the Russian Empire and then Europe back across the Atlantic. So when you look at those groups, right, let's see here. Well, I'll save that. Number two, and let me know if you have any questions or comments, if you think there was more to what was conveyed that I'm forgetting or omitting. By all means, just unmute yourself and chime right in. I invite that in class, and I also invite it via Zoom. So number two, Emma Lazarus's poem, that we did not live up to our rhetoric. And look at the most, one of the most oft quoted poems in American political history. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. All right. But is that how they were treated? According to number two, no. Right. For one, this a second book that I'm going to refer to makes it rather clear that this is a very interesting book called The Guarded Gate. The Guarded Gate by Daniel Okrent. It says bigotry, eugenics, and the law that kept 2 generations of Jews, Italians, and other European immigrants out of America. And so with that, right, you have plenty of evidence of actual ties of people between the academic community who were adhering to very exclusionary rhetoric against immigrants into the United States or into their respective countries, England, etc. and actual governments. So for instance, on this one, I've read about a gentleman named Charles Davenport. If you wanted to look him up, he worked for the State Department. He received funds from the Carnegie Institute, and he worked on Long Island with experimentation, namely with animals and food. And he worked on hybridization and looking at the phenomenon of inherited traits, right? And eugenics comes from a Greek base, evidently, that basically means the best of stock. And you have some scary stuff written in human history about this. You have Plato, you have some scary stuff written as far as anti-immigration and keeping the genetic stock more WASP from Benjamin Franklin. And so at any rate, when you look at all this kind of stuff, it's very interesting that when you look at people like Charles Davenport, when you look at people like, oh gosh, he was in touch with through an English well-renowned scientist, Galton, Galton. Let's see here. So Charles Davenport, and let me get the guy's first name. Sorry, you guys. I'm not on my A game right now. Francis Galton. Look at their collaboration and look at the work that they that was overseen on Long Island, New York, and the ties between those labs and academia, Harvard particularly, Cambridge back in England, and the actual governments with senators, etc. I mentioned a couple: Henry Cabot Lodge, Henry Adams, and others. So at any rate, they really adhered to Darwinian thought, right? The idea of natural selection getting help, if you will, right? With Darwin's theory of exospecies evolution from his book in I think it was published in 1869. His book, right, that certain species are constantly randomly evolving, and I don't mean the type of willful evolution of oh gosh, his name is eluding me, but you guys, someone out there I'm sure knows, the gentleman who contended, right, that if you needed wings, that you could almost well know that if you develop something environmentally, that it became inscribed into your DNA, and you gave Lamarck, and you gave those traits to your progeny. Darwin didn't go that far. He thought it was a random, lucky process, right? But those who happen to have a certain color that camouflaged them more effectively, a certain length of wing or leg, etc., that gave them extra swiftness, that it gave them the edge over others, right, in a hostile environment from being predated, right, by a predator. And so hence those that tended to have that lucky mutation, if you will, survived and mated with one another through natural selection. And those unique traits were carried on in an advantageous manner. Some people with eugenics, they try to apply that to human beings, to the human race. And so, yes, we're talking about like breeding individuals. They literally, of course, it didn't come to that, but it here in the US and in England, but they literally had theses that were published that advocated ideas like that. And so they would try to look at crunch numbers, et cetera, and they would try to contend that a lot of the great inventors, a lot of those who had a very reputable life, for lack of a better way of putting it, oftentimes came from the same genetic stock. And of course, this is called a so-called science now, this eugenics, but it was taken very seriously. And so there were a lot of fears that, that WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, because remember the Angles and Saxons took over Britannia, Roman England, at the fall of Rome. And so they were Germanic people, before them the Celtic people, right? And so that they supposedly represented a more highly evolved human being. And of course, look who were considered the #1 industrializing countries of the world: England, Germany, and the United States. So especially with England and Germany, consider the source. They were WASP countries. So of course they patted themselves on the back in the scientific communities and contended that it was no coincidence that they had superior genes as far as creativity, intelligence, innovative thinking, enterprising habits, etc. So on the contrary, they feared that, and this goes in with what we talked about with the robber barons, decrying things connected to social Darwinism, contending, right, that those who are poor have inferior genes. They have genes that tend to sloth, laziness, drunkenness, vice, different vices, etc. And that's the reason why they're poor. And so you have people, even some somewhat progressive feminine figures that were pushing for the rights of women, like Margaret Sanger and Victoria Woodhull, who advocated this stuff, who said we need to give birth control to the poor because we don't want them disseminating their genes. And then there was you even have people at least at the young middle-aged part of his life, like Teddy Roosevelt, who adhered to these types of concerns in this type of scientific, perspective, that he was concerned that the well-to-do, those with the best genes, were becoming outbred, if you will, by the poor and others. And so they ascribe this to the new immigrants, because the immigrants that come in, right, oftentimes a first impression is big, and a lot of them came from pre-industrial areas, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as you see here, down here in the Balkans, etc., the Russian Empire. They did not have, as complex of a society, of an industrial society, as the United States had at that time. And so a lot of them, there weren't a lot of openings yet for a managerial white-collar class amidst the Industrial Revolution. And so a lot of people were just old school artisans, were just peasant farmers. And if they were lucky, in rare cases, but very seldom, factory workers. And so a lot of them didn't have a lot of education. A lot of them didn't have a lot of skills that they had acquired and were able to, to put on their resume, if you will. And so hence when they came here, right, they weren't on their A game either. They were miserable. They had been downtrodden. A lot of them were illiterate. And then they had a different look about them, right? You look at the Celtic people, you look at the Anglo-Saxon people that invaded England, and oftentimes you get depictions of blonde-haired, fair-eyed, light-skinned people. And so they still hadn't killed the pseudoscience of phrenology, phrenology. In phrenology, they would study the skull and try to make connections between cranial measurements and how evolved you were, not just as an individual, but as a person of your nationality or your ethnicity, etc. So it became so silly where they would look at, the declination of your forehead and the lobes behind your ears, etc., and ascribe certain characteristics to it. It's no coincidence that at this time in the first decade of the 1900s, you have intelligent quotient test, IQ test. And so, of course, the leading scientists like Francis, I said it before, Galton or something like that, Galton, Francis Galton and Charles Davenport, etc. They contended, well, yeah, it's the people of WASP stock. So when you look at, people that come from the Balkans, Croatians, Bosnians, Serbians, Greek people, they don't have waspish features. The Ottoman Empire, especially, right, from the Near East, like Syria and Lebanon, and areas in the Near East. The same thing applies to the Southern Italians, who oftentimes were darker skinned, etc., and just had a non-WASP look about them. So they don't look WASP, they don't look familiar. A lot of them don't have a lot of education or a lot of skills that they were able to acquire prior to immigrating. They don't have much capital or money on them. And so hence there's that age-old, that age-old calculation of what's in it for us as far as immigrants coming into your country. Are they going to become a burden to us? Are they likely not to work? Are the states going to have to issue safety net legislation for them, like to give them unemployment checks and to provide almshouses to feed them, etc. And it's going to cost the government money. Or are they going to bring some type of skill? They're going to bring, much needed labor, etc. But the problem is, right, with number two, is we contend in American history, American exceptionalism holds on, however tenaciously, however erroneously. We try to hold on in academia, and of course, people massacre this perspective. Don't get me wrong, but they try to hold on to the fact that we as a country are exceptional. We're special. We're exceptionally the land of opportunity. We're especially the land of the free. And so that's what our rhetoric stated in that poem. And that's what Ellis Island was supposed to stand for. But you see a different story when they come, right? So when they come, there was resentment that a lot of them had jobs right off the bat because they had worked with middlemen and contractors from their own country who were coming sometimes on behalf, sometimes independently, and sometimes on behalf of private employers, robber barons back here in the US who want cheap available labor, right? So they come and they advertise in these countries and say that the streets of the United States are paved in gold, right? I mean, not literally, but metaphorically, that it's a land of opportunity. You have so much freedom, so many choices that you don't presently have here back in Europe. So come on over. And so some people paid money to these middlemen to get a steamship and to come, and they were supposed to have a job made for them already. Well, you can imagine amongst the lobbyist groups back here in the US, the labor unions, they're furious about this, right? They don't want immigrants coming and taking Americans' jobs, quote, Americans first, right? And so there was resentment about that. And so for a while, they made it illegal to have any type of work contract available for you prior to arrival. But of course, that was difficult to prove. And so a lot of immigrants were fortunate in not being able to be caught. But also when they came, right, they immediately tried to weed them out, as you see that expression there in red. So you look at these acts here, 1875, 1882, 1885, 1891, congressional laws. prohibitions or ban on certain identified immigrant conditions. Contract laborers, as I just mentioned, were denied entry, as were those failing to meet physical requirements, such as any physical deformities that might render some incapable of obtaining and maintaining a job. Any found with contagious diseases, those believed to be suffering from psychological ailments could and would often be denied entry. Financial requirements, it went from $4 to $25, them asking immigrants to pay up front and some forth of an effort to weed out the desperately poor. And so look at some of these categories, right? So the first level at Ellis Island, and boy, I've been to that station. I don't know if you guys have had an opportunity, just how moving. 12 million immigrants coming in through here. But they come into the first floor and it was very dehumanizing. The women would have to take their shirts off together in a large room. The men take off their shirts and pants, look for any identifiable physical ailments or deformities. If they thought that you were off psychologically, they would put they would put an X on your jacket, and you would have to go to a second additional examination for them to pretty much interrogate you. But look at some of these topics, some of these classifications: idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, lunatics. They would label people as such. And of course, on the declining scale, fewer were your opportunities and chances of being accepted should you be labeled with any of those. Let's say schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, etc. And so it wasn't always the same because the variables of congressional laws, how well each presidential administration and their handpicked men and women enforced those congressional laws, it varied. So you had an immigrant himself who was put in charge by Teddy Roosevelt named Oscar Strauss, and he was very lenient. And then he was followed by William Williams, who was exceptionally strict in whom he would allow to enter and whom he would not. All right. And so, I've had people mention this, just to get the wheels turning up there, that, yeah, and please remember, this is no different from a number that I'm writing down. This is not me. This is not coming from me. I just thought this was very thought provocative from a student, where he said, well, yeah, some of this is draconian. It's too far. It's ridiculous. It's hypocritical. But what about, contagious diseases and certain things such as that you have to have a practical facet to your public policy. As far as, not just allowing anyone in, criminal records, etc. So just kind of giving you food for thought. If anybody has any, informed opinions on it, I'd love to hear. But I just think this time period and this topic are rather fascinating. Anybody have any comments?
I had a question.
All right. And then you also have, and please chime in anytime you like.
Hello, Professor, can you hear me?
Number 3, new immigrants could not win, that they were caught in a vicious cycle. And there was a preponderant focus upon the Italians in particular, who were labeled as deviant, as criminally prone, etc. They're the 5 points of New York City. The 5 points had an egregious reputation for being the underbelly of society. Prostitution, murder, theft, vice districts, you name it. And then, of course, you have, you could employ some sociology here, right? What is it? Structural strain theory, whereby people are told one thing as far as this being a land of opportunity for everyone, and the opportunities are there for you to rise. But in your day-to-day reality, that is not the case. And so hence you seek an alternative means, an unorthodox manner by which to achieve that American dream, because you don't feel like the legal conduits toward the American dream are open to you. So hence you become a drug dealer, etc. Right? And so you have elements of that. You have labeling theory, that you're treated and stigmatized as criminally prone for long enough, you eventually could end up carrying out that behavior whereby you weren't criminally prone before, but you end up acting out those very stereotypical types of behavior. And so you have that with the Italians, their connection in the press with the mob, with gang activity and crime, and also with political radicalism, association with like the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world. You have the Irish Molly Maguires and other groups that they were, semi labor unions, but they also literally advocated the destruction of property, and in some cases, the taking of human lives. So they were seen to be as, radical ideologies. A lot of them were connected to Marxism in one form or another. You have syndicalism that was really big at this time. And syndicalism evidently is like a very democratic form of Marxism, whereby the local majority of laborers of the proletariat control the allocation of resources and the means of production. And they do so democratically by a local majoritarian government. And then everything from there toward the other end of the spectrum of much more authoritarian form of Marxism. And so with the Italians, try to convey here that they were not accepted. They were immediately stigmatized. Their only way to really make it economically was like with the Jewish community, was to cling together through the padrone, their labor contractors, and through their Catholic priests and other people who gave them, the lifelines as far as jobs, as far as a place to live with a decently affordable rent. And then, of course, you had dirty politicians, the political machines that saw that vacuum, and they sought to address it by way of quid pro quo, right? You scratch my back, I scratch yours, whereby they would provide jobs, provide living places to these immigrants, etc., and in return for their vote on election day. And then contemporaries against this type of corruption contend that it was not uncommon for immigrants to be told who to vote for by their local political machines, and oftentimes even voted up to 4 times on election day. So there's, ballot stuffing. But again, right, put yourself in the shoe of an Italian immigrant or another new immigrant at this time. You don't have a job yet. Suddenly one of your children becomes very grievously ill. You have no access to a doctor, and a political boss tells you, I know somebody. I know the local butcher will provide you your family some, provisions to eat for a certain allotment of time. I know someone who could provide a job for you. And I know a doctor who could come tend to your daughter or your son. And so, of course, right, what is a vote for one candidate or another for an immigrant if he's allowed those types of lifelines? And so, but nevertheless, it wasn't just the political machines that there was a public outcry against, but against the immigrants themselves for subverting the democratic process of our republic. And so it's like they couldn't win. They found themselves between a rock and a hard place in one manner after another. Another example of such is the labor unions. The standard labor unions did not open their arms to Italian immigrants. There's resentment, right, that they're taking people's jobs on the East Coast, particularly in New York and New Jersey. And so there's a contention that, you know, hey, you're not allowed to enter our labor union. But the more radical labor unions, the Marxist-oriented labor unions, were had open arm policies. And so what do you know? Some of them join the more radical labor unions. So the contention is, right, is that, you know, like with structural strain theory, they felt as if their options were very limited, and hence there's a sense of, in this narrative of Italians doing what they felt they had to do. And so in this case, you'll see a story of the starving poet, Pascal D'Angelo, a sad story. The 5 points. You see here, the press and public discourse became laden with the stigmatization of Italians as foreign-looking, olive-skinned, 5-point thugs, unaccustomed to democracy and freedom, who could not possibly be Americans if they wanted to be. Hence, they were unassimilable, right? That they were unwilling and unable, even if they were willing, to fully become WASP American. And of course, another demographic that faced that unassimilable label, of course, were Asians. They literally put it down into law in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, in a Supreme Court decision in 1878, that Asians are incapable of assimilation. So hence they are to be disenfranchised. They're to be excluded from citizenship rights that were supposed to be conveyed universally by way of the 14th Amendment. All right, so are there any questions to any of these three sections? Any thumbs up? You guys with me? Have been able to hear me throughout the period?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. All right, so you're doing the same thing that you did last time. It's pretty much a standard. Thank you guys for letting me know you're doing okay. But it's pretty much the same thing. Is you are analyzing, discerning what the thesis was, the manner by which that thesis is being supported, and then, of course, to what extent is that thesis, in your estimation, is it credible? Is it balanced? Is it fair? Is it complete? So absolutely, the type of evidence used, the type of logic or pathos employed, all that under consideration. And oftentimes I don't have a set criterion for length, but to be honest, I kind of informally expect at least half a page on these responses. And I've just graded 2 of your first 3 assignments, and you guys are doing very well. Those of you who are turning them in.
Mr. Cowell?
All right. Anybody have any questions? In conclusion.
No, none at all.
Oh ya.
All right. Making sure I have everyone's name. All right, you guys, that's it for me then. I hope you guys have a nice week. Take care of yourselves. I appreciate you coming.
Have a good
And
day.
I'm happy to give you your extra credit. Bye-bye.
Is it Carl?